What happens when a billionaire decides to shed the image of wealth and walk among us as an ordinary man? For Marcus Ellison, his simple attire and unassuming demeanor led to a shocking encounter, one that exposed the deep-seated prejudices hiding behind polished marble walls. This is the story of how one man's quiet test became a thunderous call for justice, challenging a system built on appearances. It was a brisk Monday morning when Marcus Ellison, a self-made billionaire, decided to test the waters of anonymity. Known for his philanthropic ventures and innovative businesses, Marcus had grown weary of the constant attention that his name and appearance commanded. This morning, he wore faded jeans with a small tear at the knee, a plain t-shirt with a coffee stain, and a pair of scuffed sneakers that had seen better days. He wanted to look as unassuming as possible. Marcus had a purpose: to deposit a portion of his wealth, a cool $5 million, into a new account. However, he didn't want to create a scene or draw unwanted attention. His understated appearance was meant to keep people at bay, but he underestimated the biases it would reveal. The bank was a grandiose establishment with marble floors, chandeliers, and well-dressed patrons bustling about. Marcus stepped inside, blending in about as well as a raven in a field of doves. Heads turned slightly, not in recognition but in judgment. He ignored the sideways glances and made his way to the counter where a young teller with perfectly coiffed hair and a tailored blazer stood. "Good morning," Marcus said politely. "I'd like to open an account and deposit some money." The teller's eyes scanned him with barely concealed disdain. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" she asked, her tone clipped. Marcus smiled. "Positive. I need a new account for a deposit." "How much are we talking about?" the teller asked, her skepticism thick in the air. $5 million. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, the teller looked as though she'd heard a bad joke. Then her expression hardened. "Sir, if this is some kind of prank, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. We don't entertain nonsense here." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "It's not a prank. I have the check right here," he said, pulling out an envelope from his pocket. He placed it on the counter, but the teller made no move to open it. Instead, she recoiled as if he'd handed her a piece of trash. "Security!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the hum of the bank. "Get this man out of here. How did you let him in?" Marcus frowned, his patience waning. "Ma'am, I'm here to do legitimate business." "You're making a mistake." "No, you made the mistake of thinking you could waltz in here dressed like that," she snapped. Two burly security guards approached. Without giving Marcus a chance to explain further, they grabbed him by the arms and began dragging him toward the exit. Other patrons looked on, some with smirks, others with mild shock. Nobody stepped in to intervene. Outside the bank, Marcus dusted himself off as the security guards shoved him onto the sidewalk. He looked up at the grand facade of the bank, took a deep breath, and walked away, his mind already forming a plan. 3 days later, Marcus's face was plastered across news channels and social media. The headlines were damning: "Billionaire sues prominent bank for discrimination." The lawsuit, filed by his high-profile legal team, accused the bank of racial profiling, humiliation, and a breach of professional ethics. Marcus sought $50 million in damages, 10 times the amount he had intended to deposit. Alongside the suit, he released a statement. "I came to this bank as an ordinary man, seeking ordinary service. Instead, I was judged not by the content of my character, but by the clothing on my back and the color of my skin. This experience is not unique to me, it's a daily reality for countless others. It's time for that to change." The bank scrambled to manage the fallout. Executives issued half-hearted apologies, claiming the incident was a misunderstanding. The teller was placed on leave, and the security guards' actions were under review. But the damage was done. Public outrage grew as Marcus's story spread, amplified by interviews where he shared his experiences with calm yet powerful words. The court proceedings began attracting national attention. The bank's legal team tried to discredit Marcus's claims, arguing that his appearance had created confusion. Marcus, however, remained composed, using each hearing to highlight systemic issues beyond his personal ordeal. As the trial unfolded, deeper scandals within the bank began to emerge. Whistleblowers stepped forward, revealing patterns of discriminatory practices. The public's interest turned into a full-blown reckoning, with protests forming outside the bank's headquarters demanding accountability. Despite the noise, Marcus had a bigger vision. Beyond the lawsuit, he announced plans to start a foundation dedicated to financial education and empowerment in underserved communities. "This isn't just about one man's experience," he said during a press conference. "This is about dismantling the barriers that keep so many people from accessing opportunities." The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Susan Carmichael, the teller at the heart of the controversy, was called to the stand. She appeared nervous, clutching her hands together as she took the oath and seated herself. The lawyer representing Marcus, Evelyn Grant, wasted no time. "Ms. Carmichael," Evelyn began, her tone even but firm, "can you recall the events of the morning when Mr. Marcus Ellison entered the bank?" Susan nodded hesitantly. "Yes, I do." Evelyn paced slowly, her hands clasped behind her back. "What was your initial impression of Mr. Ellison when he approached your counter?" Susan fidgeted with her fingers. He didn't look like our typical clientele. His clothes were unkempt, and he didn't seem credible when he said he wanted to deposit $5 million. So, based solely on his appearance, you decided he was not a legitimate customer?" Evelyn asked, her voice sharpening. "I didn't decide that," Susan stammered, her face reddening. "It's just that it seems suspicious. People don't usually walk in off the street and say they want to deposit that kind of money." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "And yet, Mr. Ellison provided you with a check for the amount he claimed. Did you open the envelope to verify its contents?" "No," Susan admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn nodded, letting the weight of the admission hang in the air. "Instead, you called security. Tell me, Ms. Carmichael, is it standard practice to call security before verifying a customer's documents?" Susan hesitated. "No, but I felt uneasy. I thought I was acting in the bank's best interest." "Ms. Carmichael," Evelyn said, stepping closer, "would you have reacted the same way if a man in a tailored suit had made the same request?" The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Susan's lips parted, but no words came out. Evelyn didn't wait for a response. "No further questions, Your Honor." Next, one of the security guards, Henry Thompson, took the stand. His demeanor was stoic, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes as Evelyn began her questioning. "Mr. Thompson, can you describe your interaction with Mr. Ellison on the day in question?" Henry cleared his throat. "I was called to remove a disruptive individual from the premises." "Disruptive?" Evelyn repeated, her tone skeptical. "Did Mr. Ellison yell, threaten anyone, or cause a disturbance?" Henry shook his head. "No, but the teller said he was acting suspiciously, so we followed protocol." Evelyn's gaze bore into him. "Protocol? Did you or your colleague ask Mr. Ellison any questions before escorting him out?" "No," Henry admitted, his voice gruff. "So, without verifying his identity, checking his documentation, or allowing him to explain his purpose, you forcibly removed him from the bank?" Evelyn asked, her voice growing firmer. Henry shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "We were following orders." Evelyn's voice softened, but her words were razor-sharp. "Do you believe, Mr. Thompson, that you treated Mr. Ellison with the respect and dignity owed to every customer who walks through the bank's doors?" Henry looked down, his silence speaking louder than any answer. "No further questions, Your Honor," Evelyn said, returning to her seat. The testimonies from the teller and security guards left a significant impression on the jury. Marcus remained composed, but the corners of his mouth tightened slightly, a subtle sign that the truth was coming to light. The next day, the bank manager, Richard Cole, would take the stand, where even more revelations were sure to unfold. Outside the courtroom, the media buzzed with updates, and protesters' chants echoed louder than ever. Marcus's fight wasn't just about his experience, it was becoming a movement for systemic change. The trial was far from over, but the tide was undoubtedly turning in Marcus Ellison's favor. The courtroom atmosphere was tense as Richard Cole, the bank manager, prepared to take the stand. Day 2 of the trial had drawn an even larger crowd, with journalists and onlookers eager to hear from the man responsible for overseeing the bank's operations. The stakes were high, and the weight of public scrutiny bore heavily on his shoulders. As he settled into the witness chair, Richard's polished appearance, his neatly pressed suit and carefully styled hair, did little to mask the nervous flicker in his eyes. The murmurs of the courtroom quieted as Marcus's attorney, Evelyn Grant, approached with her signature calm and unrelenting focus. "Mr. Cole," Evelyn began, her voice steady but firm, "as the branch manager of the bank, you are ultimately responsible for the conduct of your employees. Is that correct?" Richard nodded, his voice steady but wary. "Yes, that's correct." Evelyn's gaze sharpened. "Were you made aware of the incident involving Mr. Marcus Ellison on the day it occurred?" Richard hesitated, glancing briefly at the jury. "I was informed later that day by the teller involved." "And when you learned that a customer, a potential high-net-worth client, was forcibly removed from your bank, what actions did you take?" Richard shifted in his seat, his discomfort evident. "I instructed the teller to file an incident report. We take these matters very seriously." Evelyn's lips curled into a faint, skeptical smile. "Serious enough to act only after Mr. Ellison filed a lawsuit and the story made national headlines?" Richard opened his mouth to respond, but Evelyn didn't give him the chance. She raised a printed email high enough for the jury to see. "Isn't it true, Mr. Cole, that the teller in question, Susan Carmichael, sent you an email immediately after the incident, explicitly detailing her belief that Mr. Ellison did not look like someone who belonged in the bank?" The courtroom was silent as Richard hesitated, his face paling. "Yes," he admitted finally, his voice barely audible. "I received that email." Evelyn pressed forward, her tone sharp and unyielding. "And yet you allowed this judgment, this discriminatory mindset, to persist within your branch without immediate corrective action. Isn't that right?" Richard exhaled, visibly struggling to maintain his composure. "We could have acted sooner. I regret that we didn't." Evelyn nodded, her expression unreadable. "Let's discuss your training programs. How often are your employees trained to serve high-net-worth clients?" "Our staff undergoes annual training sessions on customer service and compliance," Richard answered quickly, hoping to regain control. "And does this training address implicit biases or teach employees to avoid making judgments based on appearance or race?" Richard hesitated again, his discomfort growing. "We cover inclusivity in a general sense." Evelyn seized the opening. "In a general sense? Would you say that general training was effective, given what happened to Mr. Ellison?" Richard's silence spoke volumes. Evelyn stepped back slightly, her voice softening but no less pointed. "Mr. Cole, do you believe the culture within your bank, under your leadership, created an environment where this kind of discrimination could occur?" Richard's eyes darted around the courtroom, finally landing on Marcus, who sat watching with calm intensity. "I deeply regret what happened," he said at last, his voice cracking. "It doesn't reflect the values we strive for." But Evelyn wasn't done. She held up another document. "One final question, Mr. Cole. Are you aware of previous complaints lodged against your bank for discriminatory practices? Richard stiffened, his confidence eroding completely. Those complaints were isolated incidents, he muttered. Evelyn's voice rang out clearly. Your Honor, I'd like to submit into evidence a report from the Department of Financial Oversight citing this bank for multiple violations related to discriminatory practices over the past 3 years. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, the sound only silenced by the judge's gavel. Richard's head dropped slightly, his polished persona now in tatters. The jury looked on, their expressions a mix of disapproval and disbelief. Evelyn's voice cut through the tension as she turned back to the judge. No further questions, Your Honor. As Richard stepped down from the stand, his reputation shattered, the courtroom buzzed with the weight of his admissions. Marcus Ellison sat silently, his calm demeanor belying the storm he had set in motion. Outside the courtroom, protesters chanted louder than ever, their signs demanding justice and accountability. The battle was far from over, but the tide had clearly turned in Marcus's favor. The courtroom was packed as the final day of the trial unfolded. The air buzzed with anticipation as both legal teams presented their closing arguments. Marcus Ellison sat calmly, his gaze steady, embodying the quiet dignity that had carried him through this ordeal. Evelyn Grant delivered a powerful conclusion, her voice ringing with conviction. This case isn't just about a man in a bank. It's about the prejudice that robs people of their dignity, the assumptions that devalue their worth, and the systems that perpetuate those injustices. Marcus Ellison didn't need to prove his wealth. He needed to be treated with the respect every person deserves. Today, this jury has the power to send a message that bias has no place in our institutions and accountability is not optional. The bank's lawyer attempted to frame the incident as a misunderstanding, blaming human error rather than systemic issues. But the argument fell flat in the face of the overwhelming evidence and emotional testimonies. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. The foreperson stood, the courtroom silent. We, the jury, find the defendant, Glenwood First National Bank, liable for racial profiling, emotional distress, and defamation of character. We award the plaintiff, Mr. Marcus Ellison, $50 million in damages. The announcement sparked a wave of reactions, gasps, murmurs, and applause from those seated in the gallery. Marcus sat motionless for a moment before a quiet smile spread across his face. The verdict was a resounding affirmation of his fight for justice. The judge spoke firmly. This case should serve as a reminder that institutions must be held accountable for the actions of their employees. Discrimination, whether intentional or not, cannot be tolerated in a just society. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Marcus as he stepped onto the steps. Cameras flashed, and microphones were thrust toward him. Marcus raised a hand, silencing the crowd. This victory isn't just mine. It belongs to everyone who's ever been judged unfairly, dismissed, or mistreated. It's a step toward accountability, but our work isn't done. Today, I reaffirm my commitment to breaking barriers and creating opportunities for those who have been marginalized. Together, we can build a world where everyone is valued for who they are, not how they appear. As Marcus walked away, the crowd erupted into cheers, chanting his name. His fight had started as a test of society's biases, but it had grown into a movement for change. The verdict wasn't just a win in the courtroom. It was a win for justice, dignity, and the promise of a better future. And though the trial was over, Marcus knew his mission was only beginning.